right, let's take our Bibles, please, and turn back in the Old Testament to the book of Daniel. In the 8th chapter, we are studying prophecy as we study the book of Daniel. And hopefully, you're getting a handle on it, because today, we are going to be introducing you to one that's known in the Bible as the little horn. The little horn. Now, in the future, I hope and pray that as you read the book of Daniel in years to come, you'll remember some of these things that we're talking about here, and you'll never be the same, because what we are doing is connecting current events and even future events with past history and even ancient history. And there are some things that are on the horizon right now. If you study current events, you know we are very close to the fulfillment of so many things in the Bible here. And so there are some things taking place that as we read the scriptures, we ought to be able to recognize. And one is the coming of the one the Bible calls the Antichrist. When he comes on the scene, he's going to pluck up three entities, nations, or powers, if you will. That's future, but we find somebody in the Old Testament that actually did the same thing, and that's this little horn. We know the Antichrist is going to have a mouth speaking great things. Well, we find this little horn in the Old Testament is the same way. We know that the Antichrist is going to wear out the saints. He's going to change times, which is really tragic. But we find that there was one back in the Old Testament who did the very same thing. Now, we live in a world that is rapidly changing, and we see a lot of things that are alarming and chaos and so on. But it's going to get much worse during the tribulation period, so much so that mankind is going to be heading toward annihilation. And Jesus said, were it not for the fact that he stepped in, or steps in, there would be no flesh left. And so we find out here that we find Christ is coming back again. We want to know what it's going to be like when he comes back again. So we find in Daniel chapter 8 some clues about this. And we're going to look at the first 10 verses beginning in verse 1. Daniel says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, even unto me Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first. And I saw in a vision, and it came to pass when I saw that I was at Shushan in the palace, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in a vision, and I was by the river of Ulai. Then I lifted up mine eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram, which had 2 horns. And the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no beast might stand before him. Neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand, but he did according to his will, and became great. And as I was considering, behold, an he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth, and touched not the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. And he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran into him in the fury of his power. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler against him, and smote the ram, and brake his 2 horns. And there was no power in the ram to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground, and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. Therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and for it came up 4 notable ones toward the 4 winds of heaven. And out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great, toward the south, and toward the east, and toward the pleasant land. And it waxed great, even to the hosts of heaven. And it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground, and stamped upon them." Now, here we are in Daniel chapter 8. We've been studying it verse by verse since chapter 1. And something happens here in Daniel chapter 8 that is very interesting. The language, the original language that the book was recorded in, returns back to Hebrew. Now, remember back in chapter 2, and we looked at that spot where it switched from Hebrew and it switched over to Aramaic, but now it's switching back to Hebrew, and there's a reason for that. It switched to Aramaic in chapter 2 because from that point on, God was going to show us the world history from a Gentile perspective, from a pagan perspective, and how he dealt with the Gentile nations. But now, it's going to switch back to Hebrew because God's going to show us the future, at that point at least, for the Jewish people. And at this point, the actual year in Daniel chapter 8 is about 550 BC. And we find that the Medo-Persian army conquers Babylon 10 years later in 540 BC. Now, then would come the Greek army that would fight with the Medo-Persian army for decades. Now, we've heard some of this, and I know that. And you say, well, why are we repeating it? Why is God repeating it here? Well, there's a reason that God repeats history, and it's very interesting. God, up to this point, has given us the overall picture of the Gentiles, but now he's going to repeat the same things with this perspective of how it affects the Jews, because this relates to God's chosen people at that time, the Jewish people. And these other nations, like the Medo-Persians and the Greeks and so on, they're really only mentioned here because they touch God's chosen. And we find that the camera of heaven follows his chosen. In fact, I believe that today the eye of God is on his New Testament churches. And I find that in the book of the Revelation, where we find Christ in 95 AD looking down and addressing some churches in Asia Minor like this one and giving specifics on them, saying, well, I see this and I see that. I've been watching. And so I believe that the New Testament church means a lot to the Lord. I believe the Fargo Baptist Church means a lot to the Lord. And I believe the eye of the Lord is on his churches today and his people and his ministries and the sermons and so on, and even the things in the FM area here. Really, as they touch this church or we touch them, that's what's interesting to heaven at this point. You know, back when I was in high school, I read Sports Illustrated all the time. And I'll never forget, and made a buzz in our high school up in East Grand Forks. One of the classmates appeared in Sports Illustrated, but not because of his athletic prowess, but he happened to be at a college game somewhere in the Midwest, and he was standing along the sidelines, and they were filming this future Heisman Trophy winner, and they went by, and there he is standing in our school Letterman jacket on the side, and I thought, there's Kaiser in Sports Illustrated, and really it had nothing to do with him. The camera was following the former Heisman winner, but he got in the picture. And so it is with really the Gentiles today, or the heathen today, that just happen to cross our paths or the paths of God's people and so on. They somehow get noticed by heaven. But the only reason that God is noticing these Gentile nations here is because they overlap with the Jews. So here in Daniel chapter 8, and in verse 1, let's get started. It says, in the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar, Daniel says, a vision appeared unto me, even unto me, Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first. And so we notice the time frame here. He mentions this is actually the third year of the reign of Belshazzar. Remember Belshazzar, the guy who had that drunken feast that night, and the kingdom of Babylon fell? Well, we find, if you look across the page in chapter 7 and verse 1, that vision, it says, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and so on. So these two visions here took place while Babylon was still the world empire. It was before the fall of Babylon. And you'll notice where it took place in verse number 2 of chapter 8. Daniel says, and I saw in a vision, and it came to pass when I saw that I was at Shushan in the palace. Well, Shushan is not Babylon. Shushan is 230 miles away from Babylon. It was in Persia, or what would be modern-day Iran. Babylon would be in modern-day Iraq. Now, whether Daniel was there actually or only there in the vision, I don't know. If you've ever had a dream, you're in that dream wherever that dream has taken place, even though you're at home in bed. And so we don't know if Daniel's actually in Babylon and he's dreaming that he's in Shushan. We don't know that. But Shushan is a city that's mentioned in both Esther and Nehemiah, which would come along about 30 to 40 years later from this time. But Daniel is about to get some additional information on the second and the third kingdom. Now, we remember how this thing played out with the 5 kingdoms. The first one is Babylon. That's that nation of gold. And we find that they're conquered by the Medo-Persians. That's that nation of silver. And they get conquered by the Greek Empire. That's that nation of brass, who would be conquered by the Roman Empire. That's that nation of iron. And then we know that there's this fifth one coming along, but we won't get into that right now. In verse 3, Daniel says, then I lifted up mine eyes, and I saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. So he's by this river, he sees this ram has 2 horns, but one is higher than the other. And you say, well, what is this all about? Well, we know that the first horn here is Darius the Mede. This is actually the Medo-Persian Empire represented by a ram. And the first horn is Darius the Mede. He is the short horn in verse 3. And there's a reason for that. He didn't reign as long as his counterpart. The second horn would represent the second king, and that would be Cyrus the Persian. So you've got Darius the Mede, you've got Cyrus the Persian. He's the long horn, and he overshadowed the short horn because Darius only reigned 2 years, and Cyrus reigned 20 years, 10 times as long. And God makes a point of being precise, and that's how he depicts things. So we find this ram, he has 2 horns, one is higher than the other, and it depicts here these 2 kings of the Medo-Persian Empire, but you have to read into it a bit. And you say, well, why doesn't God just come out and say that? Because he wants us to dig it out. In fact, Proverbs 25 says it's the glory of God to conceal a thing. You say, well, what's he playing hide and go seek, No, he wants us to study, and he wants us to think, and he wants us to dig it out and to investigate, and so he will conceal things so that we get beneath the surface. In fact, we're told to do that. Bible says, study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. If God just came right out and just laid it out for us, we'd get lazy and we'd never dig a little bit. And so he makes us dig. Well, it goes on in verse 4. Daniel says, I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no beast might stand before him, neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand. But he did according to his will and became great. So this is the ram. This is the Medo-Persian Empire. And we find here it's coming out of the east, and it's pushing toward the west, and it's conquering Babylon there by the Euphrates. And we know how that happened that night. Belshazzar's having that feast. Historians tell us the water gate was left open. The Medo-Persian Empire made these latter things, and they laid them down across the dried up Euphrates River that had been diverted into its original channel. And the Medo-Persian Empire were able to come in the middle of that feast, and God had foreordained all that, and Babylon was conquered. So here's the Medo-Persian Empire. They're pushing westward. They conquered Babylon. They're pushing northward, and that would be the region of Macedonia. And they're pushing southward. That would be the region of Egypt. They're conquering all that. And that was really the extent of the Medo-Persian conquest. Now, ironically, the national emblem would be a ram. But this was written before that. The coins have been dug up by the archaeologists, and they depict the national emblem of the Medo-Persian Empire as a ram, like the United States has this emblem of a bald eagle. I just saw one yesterday. And by the way, Benjamin Franklin wanted it to be the turkey. And I'm going, wow, I just don't get it. But anyway, in verse number 4, we read again, Daniel says, I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward. Notice this, so that no beast might stand before him, neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand, but he did according to his will and became great. That word great denotes full of himself, by the way. Great in the sense he got prideful and superior, and like his kingdom was going to last forever, but it didn't. Because in verse 5, Daniel says, and as I was considering, behold, an he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth, and touched not the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. Now, look behind me if you would, and you'll really see the kingdom of the Medo-Persian Empire. And you'll see kind of that mint green area. That's what Babylon had conquered. And you look over to the east and the northeast, and you see what Media would have made up, and a little to the south of them, the Persian Empire. Those two combined, they conquered Babylon, and then they went into the region of Lydia and that violet or purplish area there, and that would have been the extent of the Medo-Persian Empire. And we find in verse number 6 that, and he, that is this goat, came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and he ran unto him in the fury of his power. Now, that word fury there, it denotes a poisonous wrath in the Hebrew. It's the word kama. And we find here that this goat is ticked off, and he comes in all his fury, and he plows in to the ram. Verse number 7, it says, Daniel says, and I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler against him. That means extreme bitterness. Mara is the Hebrew word there. And so between the Medo-Persian Empire and the Greek Empire, there was no lost love. You need to understand that these two had been fighting for decades. And it was a cat fight, a dog fight, and it was always a bad blood between them. There was always festering. And Daniel here is hearing from God that this fight between these two is a personal one. And the Medo-Persian Empire had battled with Greece many times. Now, by the time Greece is done conquering, look behind me again and notice all that area in that yellowish, greenish color there. Not only the Babylon, the Persian, the Medo-Persian, but it actually swept west or east into India and Armenia, Cappadocia, Asia. It goes up into Macedonia, and that region there, of course, Greece would have that would have been home for them. But we find here it was a much bigger area, and Greece conquered a ton of land. In verse number 7, apparently it got nasty, because Daniel says, I saw him, that goat with Alexander as the horn, come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler against him, and smote the ram, and brake his 2 horns. And there was no power in the ram to stand before him. But he, Alexander in Greece, cast him, the Medo-Persian Empire, down to the ground, and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. We find here they went to battle. And you and I can read this, and it's totally bloodless to us. It's just clean pages of the Bible. But put yourself there. You know, I've been to some ancient battlefields. And I can only imagine what it would have been like to fight wars with swords and spears and arrows, and how awful that would have been. It's something that man has been doing since the time of Cain. And all this bloodshed of war now, we don't even know when and where and how, for the most part, it took place. We don't follow it. It's ancient history. It means nothing now. But at the time, they gave everything for this. You know, I read about something that happened in, I think it was 1939. The coffin, the golden jeweled coffin of Charlemagne, the once great ruler of Europe, was, I think it was in the Aachen Cathedral in Germany. And the Germans took it out of there for safekeeping because they were getting bombed, and they hid it someplace. Of course, Germany was finally conquered, and that coffin of Charlemagne fell into the hands of the U.S. military. And it was about midnight one night when Jack Bradford, a sergeant from Minneapolis, of all places, over in Europe, made a phone call to his superior, and he said, I got the bones of that dead guy. What do you want me to do with them? Talking about the great Charlemagne. Here's the great Charlemagne, the one who conquered Europe at the time and united it, and thousands died in the process, and nobody cares about that anymore. They're just the bones of the dead guy. And I think how much that meant at the time, but how foolish it was, how shallow it was. So now the Greek army is conquering the Medo-Persian army, and the Greek army is depicted by this goat, and this goat conquers so swiftly that his feet don't even touch the ground. And that really depicts how quickly the Grecian Empire comes out of nowhere and rails on the Medo-Persian Empire and stamps into bits. And it implies here the ram is looking for some help, but nobody's going to step in. Nobody's going to mess with Greece at that time. We find out they were too feared. We find that from that goat, there's this notable horn that comes up. It's mentioned in verse number 5, a notable horn. Who is this horn on this goat? Well, God answers that for us. In verse number 21, and the rough goat is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Well, that king is Alexander the Great. So we find here that Greece defeats the Medo-Persian Empire in 335 BC, and it was totally out of nowhere. The feet didn't touch the ground because Alexander the Great worked with a smaller army. In fact, he defeated the Medo-Persian army with an army 1/5 the size. It was 5-1. And they say at that final battle there was 250,000 Medo-Persian troops, and Alexander had 50,000, exactly 5-1. And the tactic was, and this is hard to believe, but Alexander the Great sacrificed several thousand men, just allowed them to be slaughtered, kind of as a diversion move, and then flanked around some men, and it was genius, but it was a setup. You know, there's a few amazing facts about Alexander the Great a lot of people don't realize. We've heard of Plato and Socrates and men like that. Well, Aristotle, one of those ancient Greek philosophers, was the personal mentor of Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great was an absolute military genius. They cannot explain it, but his battle tactics are still being studied to this day. He started at the age of 18 when his father died, Philip Macedon, and in 15 years he never lost a battle. Over 15 years. And part of his secret was he always worked with this smaller, speedier army. It's the goat that didn't touch the ground. Now, Alexander the Great had a big ego, and actually he named no less than 70 conquered cities after himself, including Alexandria and Egypt and so on. But Alexander the Great actually believed that he was the son of Zeus, the Greek god. And in verse number 8, we read on about him. It says, therefore the he-goat waxed very great. Notice that area he conquered a moment ago. And when he was strong, the great horn, Alexander the Great, was broken. And for it came up 4 notable ones toward the 4 winds of heaven. And so we find out here that this horn is Alexander the Great. We find out that when he dies, in verse number 8, when he is very strong, there were 4 notable ones that came toward the 4 winds of heaven. And that speaks of the fact that he died and there were his 4 generals that replaced him. The kingdom was split up. Verse 22 mentions something about that. It says, now that being broken, whereas 4 stood up for it, 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power, not in the power that Alexander the Great had. So Alexander conquered the Medo-Persian Empire, and Darius III in around 334, 335 BC. He came from the west, the direction of Macedonia and Greece. The Bible says swiftly, and conquered the Medo-Persians. The Medo-Persians had ruled for 200 years. That's almost as long as we've been a nation here. And here's this young 18-year-old upstart who comes in and within 15 years conquers him. And with that, owns the title deed to the world, conquered the world. And at age 33, Alexander was king of the world. He had conquered the world. And historians tell us that he went back to Babylon and he sat down and he wept because there were no more kingdoms to conquer. I mean, that was the thing he was living for, and now what next? You know, back in the early 90s, Michael Jordan had won several NBA championships with the Chicago Bulls. And finally, it was kind of like, you know what, I don't see the point in doing this anymore. And so he left basketball, and some of you remember he went into baseball, and he never made it in baseball. I think that was 93, 94. And so he came out of retirement, and he went back in the NBA, and he was rusty. And he even commented, I'm not even the best guy on my team anymore. He said Pippen was. And anyway, he worked his way back up, and he won more championships, and he finally retired in 99. But, you know, I thought of Alexander the Great as kind of like, you know, I've done this, been there, done that, and what's left? And he wept. You know, as a Christian, let me just say this. You and I never plateau, do we? You and I never lose our purpose because we have something called the Great Commission, don't we? And that means until the last soul has been won to Christ, we have a job to do. We have the unsaved to reach. You know, there's tons of people on the mission field, and I was reading a missions letter to you today and so on, and there's so many folks to reach out there. There's so many ministries we could engage in. You know, I've even seen preachers coast after they've been in the pastorate for a while, and I think to myself, how can we do that? Now, here at Fargo Baptist Church, the buildings have been built, they have been paid for. We have a good group of people. We have folks being saved. We have folks getting baptized. We have a great staff. We had a great meeting earlier today. We have resources. We have wonderful music. We have great preaching. Excuse me. We have great fellowship, and we have a sweet spirit. And honestly, we could rest on our laurels, couldn't we? We could say, you know, we've arrived. But you know, as long as we have breath in us, we dare not plateau. We dare not coast. We always have a new horizon. And we ought to never sit down and weep like Alexander and say, well, that's it. Because the great work of the Lord is inexhaustible, beloved. It's inexhaustible. And there's always new worlds to conquer. And I am so glad that we have a greater cause than Alexander the Great. You know, I had a couple of Bible studies on Monday, and I got finished, and I was just rejoicing. I was just energized, and I was thinking to myself, you know, one soul is worth more than the whole world. And we can make a lot of to-do about the Super Bowl, and there's just outrageous fanfare over stuff like that, and heaven is yawning about that. And the Bible has this to say, for what shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? One soul is worth more than the whole world, right? Do we see the value of one? Tremendous value. And so God is interested in the salvation of the sinner. In fact, I read in Luke 15:10, Jesus said, there's joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner that repenteth. That is headline news in heaven. One sinner has repented, and heaven has a fit. And heaven comes unglued every time somebody comes to Christ. And here's poor Alexander out there conquering his world and killing his thousands. And he missed the boat. And he learned a hard lesson, no doubt. Because the stuff of this world will never, ever, ever fulfill us. Never. You know, I showed a picture of Brother Clayton and myself along the Atlantic Ocean the other night as we closed the service. And I didn't tell you the whole story, but we were out there because we were watching this rocket take off. And we were right across the bay from an actual rocket taking off from Cape Kennedy. And the rocket is being sent up there by some guy I think he's got over $200 billion. And you know the whole story there. And it's just kind of, what else should I do with it? I'll play with it. I'll go up in space and conquer Mars and whatever else and so on. And I thought to myself, the things that people live for, and even the richest get bored and they move on to something else. And there are a lot of people, folks, and they're pursuing something. In fact, while we were out there on Ormond Beach, we went by John D. Rockefeller's home in Florida there, just beautiful. And they asked him at one time, with all your millions, what are you living for? He said, to just make one more dollar. One more dollar. Can you imagine that? And there are those who are living to build a business or whatever it might be. It's all a mirage. None of it fulfills. It's all fleeting outside of God. And there is really only one thing in this world that has purpose and the point of life, and it's living for Christ. And take it from Solomon, somebody who had it all, somebody who tried it all, and he categorized it as vanity. When he got done, he said, it's all vanity. I don't know if you've ever thought of backsliding and just going back into the world, but I can tell you right up front, there's nothing there. There's nothing worth going back to the world for. In fact, in John chapter 6, Jesus Christ preaches a tough message, and that superficial crowd, they leave Jesus, and Christ looks at his disciples, and he says, will you go away also? Well, then Simon Peter answered him, Lord, to whom shall we go? Thou hast the words of eternal life. Now, sometimes Peter could be a chowderhead, but he nailed it there, didn't he? I mean, he said it. He said, where? I mean, what should we, where? I mean, there's nothing out there. And how true that is. To whom shall we go? Thou hast the words of eternal life. And Peter was one who had left it all. And I'm sure he had no regrets. No regrets. You know, a real Christian who tries to go back to the world is going to feel like they've fallen in a pig pen. It's just, you're going to feel like, yuck, I'm not comfortable here. Because the only one thing that is worth living for is your great God and my great God. Alexander conquered the world, but he totally struck out. When it came to life, he fanned. He died, and he died after this lingering death. It started with a big night of boozing it up. In fact, he was already drunk, and he called for the Herculean cup, this big cup, and ordered it filled full of booze. He was going to prove what a man he was, and he drank it all down, every last drop of the Herculean cup, and he passed out, of course, and he never recovered. He was a guy that just didn't know the meaning of moderation. He just did everything to the hilt, but he really lived a worthless life in the long run. Proverbs 25 says, "He that hath no rule over his own spirit is like a city that is broken down and without walls." And that was Alexander the Great. He could conquer the world, but he could not control himself. And after he died, his successor, Antipater, ordered the murder of Alexander's wife, the murder of his son. I mean, that's just the cutthroat stuff that they did. It was nasty, and I'm sure it's like, okay, all that conquering, what did it give you? Absolutely nothing. Alexander conquered the world, but he couldn't conquer himself. And he lingered for a while after he had passed out, and he came to and he passed out. And when he did come to, he knew he was dying. He ordered something done at his funeral. He wanted gold strewn in front of the procession to show that this is how worthless gold is. We're gonna step on it. And he also ordered that his hands be placed outside the cloth of the funeral bier to show that they were empty. He said, I want them to be flapping in the wind and just showing how I left with nothing. He conquered the world, but he left with nothing. I've read before this comparison made to Jesus and Alexander because they both died at age 33, but that's where any similarity ends. Their lives were totally different. Well, in verse number 8, back to Alexander, we read, Daniel says, "Therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken. And for it came up 4 notable ones toward the 4 winds of heaven." The kingdom split 4 ways. In fact, historians tell us between these 4 generals, they couldn't decide who should be the new leader. So for the next 20 years, they were fussing about this. And these men aged from somewhere in their maybe 30s, like Alexander, into their 50s, if you can imagine that. And finally, well, verse 22 tells us, it says, "Now that being broken," that is that horn of Alexander, "whereas 4 stood up for it, 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. It would never be the same." Look back in chapter 7, if you would. And in verse number 6, we find that Greece is depicted by the leopard. "And after this I beheld, and lo, another like a leopard, which had upon the back of it 4 wings of a fowl. The beast had also 4 heads, and dominion was given to it." This is just another way of saying the same thing. When Alexander died, it was split 4 ways. So we see here Alexander the Great is the he-goat. And by the way, the national emblem of Greece would become the goat. And it would be on their coins that they would dig up out of the sand later. Bible called it 200 years earlier. Now, it's split up 4 ways, and Seleucus is really the general that we want to focus in on. More about it in a moment. But Seleucus would be the general that Syria would come out of, and out of the Syrian dynasty would arise a despicable king by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes, who would clearly be a picture of the Antichrist. More about him in a moment. Verse number 9, it says, "And out of one of them," that is, those 4 notable ones, "came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great toward the south, and toward the east, and toward the pleasant land. And it waxed great even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground, and stamped upon them." Now, there's a ton of prophecy in this. And you might be reading it, scratching your head, but I'm just going to tell you up front, it's speaking of Antiochus Epiphanes. And Antiochus Epiphanes would be a ruler of the Syrians who would come out of the Seleucus branch of the 4 generals that came out of Alexander the Great. Antiochus would be incredibly cruel to the Jewish people, just like the Antichrist. You know, I had lunch the day before yesterday with a Jewish man, and we were talking about the Jewish nation, and I said to him, you know, if you had no other proof whatsoever of God, look at the Jew. Look at the nation of Israel. Look at their history. Look at the promises made to them. Look at the fact that they could never be annihilated, and the fact that the devil absolutely hates Israel because they testify of God. And the Antichrist is going to go after Israel exactly the way Antiochus Epiphanes went after Israel. But the devil is really going to be behind it all. Never forget, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, and so on. And so all that violent history that I've been talking about, you know, the spears and the swords and the arrows and the impalings and the throats cut and all of that, the devil is behind all that. It's satanic influence. He loves violence. He loves bloodshed. Jesus said this. He said to the devil's crowd, "You're of your father, the devil, and the lust of your father ye will do. He was a murderer from the beginning." And from the time of Cain on, the devil has influenced all of this. You know, in the years since, we've seen the devil working in the shadows to cause the deaths of millions and the bloodshed by the gallons, so much. And we can point fingers at Hitler's, and rightly so. But Hitler had some inspiration. When he wanted to annihilate the Jews, who do you think was behind that? The Jews testify of God. Now, the Bible tells us we are not ignorant of Satan's devices. There are things that, I'm telling you, his fingerprints are all over him. And in the world today, he's destroying families, and he's destroying nations. He's destroying churches. He's destroying believers. And he's using the same landmines that he's always used to take people down. He's out to take you down. And you can't be ignorant of his devices, and shouldn't be, because they're predictable. In fact, there are patterns. The devil reuses tactics. He repeats himself. I'm going to show you that, because as you study prophecy, you can't miss it. There are some events that take place. Now, all of this is leading up to somebody known as Antiochus Epiphanes. He is this little horn that I just want to introduce you to today. I want you to take a good look at that evil face behind me. This is a bust of Antiochus Epiphanes. He was born in 215 BC. He rose to the rank of the head of the Seleucid Empire by 175 BC. He only reigned 11 years up until 164 BC. He died in what would be modern-day Iran today. He was an absolute, total egomaniac and a nut. He was a major villain, a turbo villain, and a persecutor of the nation of Israel, and definitely inspired by the devil, and one of the greatest types of the Antichrist in the Bible. And so if you and I want to figure out what to expect from the coming Antichrist, all we got to do is look back in history to this guy and follow his life. And so Alexander the Great dies. His kingdom is split into 4 generals, and the Seleucid dynasty gets the area of Syria, of Syria and so on. And from that, you get this guy, Antiochus Epiphanes, who's one of the most eccentric men ever. In fact, those who even lived at the time who were under him called him Antiochus Epimanes. That's short for maniac, madman. They said he is a madman. Antiochus was totally enamored by Hellenism. Hellenism is Greek culture. And he loved the most perverted parts of it. He made it his goal to Hellenize the world, and especially the Jewish people. The Jewish people were the ones who didn't want to be Hellenized. The battle cry was to conform or die. And by the way, that sounds familiar. When you're a nonconformist and it comes to God's convictions, you can expect to be persecuted even bitterly. It's an old tactic of Satan. Antiochus used it. The Antichrist is going to use it because, again, the devil is not original, never original, and we're not ignorant of his devices. So it was a bloodbath
for God's people, the Jews under Antiochus Epiphanes, and once again it will be under the Antichrist one day. If you want to learn about the Antichrist, study the man Antiochus Epiphanes, because you're going to have the same devil pulling the same stunts, and the Antichrist is going to be a carbon copy of Antiochus. You know, Antiochus, you even hear Antichrist in that, don't you? I don't know if that has any credence or not, but as we study from this point on in the book of Daniel, it is going to become difficult to discern who it's talking about, the coming Antichrist or Antiochus who's already come, because it's basically history repeating itself under satanic influence. You know, Solomon said, the thing that hath been is that which shall be, and that which is done is that which shall be done, and there is no new thing under the sun.
We're going to see times when Daniel is actually referring to both of them, to both Antiochus Epiphanes and the Antichrist. Now, there is a shift in gears between verses 8 and 9, and there are some years that pass. If you're following with notes, Alexander the Great died on June 10th, 323 BC. Over the next 20 years, there was that power struggle I talked about. 20 years, finally around 301, that kingdom split four ways. Antiochus Epiphanes was born in 215 BC. So that means there's 108 years between verses 8 and 9. If you want to put that in the margin of your Bible, feel free to do that. 108 years elapsed between verses 8 and 9. Now, you say, well, why did God skip 108 years? Because it wasn't important to him. It had nothing to do with the Jews. And we need to understand that. God just skips over it. The camera of heaven just sweeps over it. I mean, a lot of stuff it sweeps over. Super Bowls and Grammy Awards and Oscars. It's like, really? God has no interest in that stuff. So in verse number 9, we skip 108 years, and now we're talking about Antiochus Epiphanes. And out of one of them, the four generals, came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great, toward the south, toward the east, and toward the pleasant land. So here's how the kingdom split four ways in 301 BC. The four generals were, first of all, Cassander. Cassander got the area of Greece and Macedonia. That's where... over 300 years later, Paul would get the Macedonian call. The second general, Lucius, would take the region of Thrace and Asia Minor. That's where Turkey is. That's really the cradle of Christianity. And Paul did a lot of work there as well. The third general, Seleucus, we've talked about him. He would get Syria and the Middle East. And then Ptolemy, he would get Egypt. We talk about the Ptolemaic range. Also in verse number 9, the beginning at least says, and out of one of them came forth a little horn. The one of them is Seleucus, who got Syria, and the little horn would be an up-and-coming Syrian king, really the 8th Syrian king, by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. There were 6 in between, the first and him. He only reigned 11 years. We'll find out why later. And the Bible says he waxed great in various directions, but especially the pleasant land. That's Palestine. That's Israel. And we find here Antiochus Epiphanes did the same thing to rise to power. He stepped on people just like the Antichrist is going to. And we find out here that the history of Antiochus Epiphanes is going to shed a lot of light on the Antichrist, because Antiochus is in the books. It's history, it's past, it's old news. I'm more curious about the future. But we find that Antiochus parallels the Antichrist. In fact, there's this verse in Micah 5 I was discussing with Brother Benham today. It says, the Assyrian shall come into our land, and when he shall tread in our palaces, and it goes on. And it could be talking about the Antichrist, and we find that he's Assyrian. And though Jewish, the Antichrist could also be a direct descendant of Antiochus Epiphanes. We don't know. But the world is currently looking for a Superman, someone to deliver this world out of this mess. And as we study Antiochus Epiphanes, we'll be studying the Antichrist and vice versa here. And what Antiochus Epiphanes and the Antichrist will do to the Jewish people will make Hitler look like a choir boy. So we've been introduced to Antiochus Epiphanes, and from him we'll spend some time talking about him in the future.